sufficient at the moment.
I want to move on to a controversial subject, depending on how you view it. Some people view it as a solution, others see it as a big demon, and that is genetically modified crops. What are your views on that?
Well, I think genetic modification was a technology that was badly promoted to the consumer. It started out with genes that were really only of interest to large agribusiness corporations. And consumers in many countries, including Australia, I think quite reasonably said, look, we're not going to put this stuff in our mouths just because you say so. We're not sure it's safe, we're not sure it's wholesome, and why should we enhance your bottom line? Why would you want, herbicide-ready toast, for example? Now, I think I know from my own research that if there were things in the genetically modified crops that benefited consumers, like reduce their risk of bowel cancer or reduce their risk of heart disease, if the transgenes that were used had a benefit for the consumer, then consumers would have eaten them quite happily. As indeed consumers do eat them quite happily in the United States, but less so elsewhere. So I think that these technologies need to be developed with much more consultation and sensitivity for consumers, not just for farmers and agribusiness. I do think it's a good technology and it's going to deliver benefits, but it's not a silver bullet. It's not going to solve the problem of the global food shortage on its own, because so far GM has not increased the world's food supply.
And then I also want to talk about something that actually we're seeing an impact this year's wheat crop, and we're seeing right now as of this date, even with corrections, wheat prices are up almost 27%, and that's the red rust disease, or I think it's UG99. Let's talk about some of the challenges and problems scientists face keeping diseases of crops and livestock in check.
Yeah, this is something scary that most people haven't even heard of yet. It's almost like the script for a horror movie. In the late 1990s, a new rust exploded out of southern Africa. It was first found in Uganda, that's why it's called UG99. And they didn't know where it had come from, but it started killing wheat crops. And then it spread into Kenya, where it killed a hell of a lot of wheat crops. It killed, I think, about 3/4 of the wheat crop. And then it jumped into Arabia. And from there it jumped across the Gulf into Iran. And basically it's been heading towards the Indian grain bowl. And if it gets there, I mean, we're looking at a world bread crisis. We haven't had a global rust epidemic since the 1950s or 60s. And the trouble with this particular rust is it attacks almost every type of wheat that we grow in the world. The majority of wheat are vulnerable to it, and if it broke out, it would cause a serious reduction in the size of the world harvest. So scientists who were busy working on improving agricultural technologies and developing better systems for farmers have suddenly had to be pulled away from that work and put on to trying to fix this rust problem. Cornell University's brought together a world team. They're working on it like crazy. But at the moment, we are incredibly vulnerable to a global rust epidemic that could, halve the amount of wheat produced and probably triple the price of bread.
Well, we'll certainly see the price of wheat this year. I'm just looking at grain prices. Corn, we've seen a correction here in the last week or so, but still, corn prices are up 34.5%. Wheat prices up 26%. Sugar prices up 19%. Soybean prices up 18%. Julian, a couple final questions. Let's talk about biofuels. Does it really make a lot of sense to try to take 1/3 of our corn crop and put it in our gas tank?
It may make sense for America or for parts of America, because America has a big corn surplus. But if you look at the global issue, no, it doesn't make sense, because we're going to need all the land we can get for food production. When we have to double food production to meet the needs of 10 billion human beings, we won't be wasting any land at all growing fuels, let me tell you that. So if the land is used to grow fuels in Brazil or America today, that may not be the case in 20 years' time. That's all I can say on that. There may be other ways that we can get biofuels. We may be able to farm algae in the sea, as NASA has proposed. We may be able to farm algae in salt lakes or coastal wetlands or something like that. So we can produce biodiesel from them, and they don't take up a lot of farmland, although they will compete with agriculture for fertilizer. So there may be ways that we can produce sustainable fuels, but I think that biofuels broadly are not an answer. I mean, at the moment, China is so alarmed at its own potential food shortage. They're going around the world buying up land in places like the Philippines and Vietnam and Laos and so on, in order to produce oil or fuel for their agriculture and industry. This is ridiculous. It's just taking away from the world's stock of food-producing land, and it's going to make the whole of the world food supply much less stable. So we need to be quite pragmatic about this. The biofuels, and they're never going to supply the world's liquid fuel needs. There's never going to be enough of them to do that, I don't think, given the costs and the difficulties of developing them. But they could supply a decent proportion of local fuel. And if we do it with algae farming or something like that, we can probably do it in a way that doesn't interfere with food production, but in fact benefits it. Indeed, you could take the wastes from the city, all that organic waste, the food that we throw away, and use it to feed algae. And you could then use those algae to produce food, stock feed, and fuel. And that would be a very neat solution.
As you look to the future, and as you mentioned in your book, it's unlikely that government is going to solve this problem. It's going to be up to the individual. What does the future look like to you? I mean, I've seen a number of books. I've read one called Farm City, and it may sound strange for you and I talking like this, Julian, but in World War II, we had things such as victory gardens, and if you were to go back into the 20s, 30s, 40s, or maybe even the 50s in this country, it was not unusual that people had gardens in their backyard where they grew tomatoes and various crops. Are we going back to that direction, in your opinion?
I think there's always scope for individuals to grow their own fresh food within cities. But you're starting to see things like hospitals, growing fresh vegetables hydroponically on their roofs in order to feed patients who are recovering from surgery or something like that with good, fresh food. So the possibility of industrial scale agriculture or horticulture in cities is also a very exciting one. And there's quite a lot of talk in the architectural profession going on now about how we combine agricultural processes with urban living and industrial production and things like that. And so I think the opportunity is there. The real reason is that the cities are harvesting points for enormous quantities of water and enormous quantities of nutrients. And it makes the most sense economically to use that water and use those nutrients right where you've got them in the city, rather than ship them hundreds of miles back to a farm somewhere. So the first thing you should do with your recycled sewage really is to use it to grow food crops. And the reason for doing it is that cities are harvesting points for enormous quantities of water and nutrients, and it makes good economic sense to use that water and those nutrients right where they're available in the city, rather than truck them hundreds of miles up to a farm somewhere, although you could do that as well. So there are opportunities to develop new style farming industries, both urban and peri-urban and indeed rural, which I think make the whole of food a much more exciting proposition. And then, there are more than 1,000 vegetables that we have never seen in our supermarkets, and these are eaten by indigenous people all over the world. They're good, they're tasty, they're nutritious, they're exciting. So this vegetable-rich diet that I'm advocating is going to be a much more interesting thing than many people assume it's going to be. It's going to be fascinating, a culinary adventure, as well as a sound health policy for us.
Well, Julian, you bring up some interesting points in your book. There is certainly a problem that lies out there, and we can either try to address it in advance or deal with it when it arrives as a crisis. The name of the book is called The Coming Famine, the Global Food Crisis, and What We Can Do to Avoid It. And we've been speaking with its author, Julian Cribb.